how the historian's interest in genocide interacts with or differs from the archaeologists or anthropologists or economic anybody who might be working on genocide. So one guess I have is that your role, while data collection is obviously important, is synthesis in the form of narrative, but also maybe a broader, more diachronic focus.
Right. No, I think that's exactly it. An archaeologist will look at, the results of what's been dug up at various sites. And I just read a piece actually in our World History of Genocide, a nice piece that was written by a couple of people who are clearly part of the prehistory, the field of prehistory. I won't call it archaeology. I think they're prehistorians more than they're archaeologists, but they read archaeological results and they say, okay, it's tough. We go from grave to grave. There are these results. These people had their craniums bashed in here and those had their craniums bashed in there. Is this genocide? Is this not? Was it massacre? Was it war? And there are various implements and problems and issues that they focus on to try to understand that problem. Right. And so they're very much into the sites. I mean, when you mention archaeologists, they're into the, several dozen well-developed sites, especially in Europe or the newer sites. They're always discovering new stuff. So there are new caves, where there are new remains of people who may have been in mass graves. And the people in mass graves, they try to understand, okay, what's going on in those mass graves? Why are there mass graves, right? And they ask different kinds of questions. And obviously what I do, I say, I don't know, I think in the world history, I must have said 5 sentences about prehistory or 6 sentences. So my job then is to, read what they say in general and then try to, give my 6 sentences about what happened in prehistory. And so it's a very different kind of enterprise. And, their work is very detailed and very valuable and changing all the time. We're learning new things all the time. And then there are new hypotheses, and the whole business of the origins of man and, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens and others. There are now obviously they're discovering other sapiens who are out there, right? And who they dig up and they say, wait a minute, this is not Neanderthal and this is not Homo sapien. This is something different. And so, they have a different kind of job than we do. And, they do their job well. I worked with archaeologists. Actually, some of my time in Yugoslavia was spent on archaeological digs, working with kind of Bronze Age peoples, the Illyrians, who lived on the what is Yugoslavia today. And we were digging up Illyrians, basically. And it was, it's exciting, but very precise work, very difficult work where you have to be very careful about, what you're measuring, what you're preserving, how you identify it and so on and so forth. So it's a very, interesting, professional, branch of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a whole host of conceptual questions we could talk about, but because I'd like to get to the specifics, I'll try to limit myself to just one more. So my understanding is that genocide is a relatively recent concept, which is, reflected in the fertile soil for debate you've already alluded to, but what is its origin and how did people think of what we now consider genocide before its definition had been agreed upon? And I guess it's not agreed upon yet.
So obviously, I think, and I have written about genocide before there was a term genocide. And people called it various things, horrible catastrophes or catastrophe like no other, or, mass killing or mass murder or whatever. People called it various things. Churchill during the Second World War at one point, early on in the Nazi campaign in the East, says we are in the presence of a crime with no name. In point of fact, there was this Polish Jewish jurist, international jurist by the name of Raphael Lemkin, who had been struck by this fact for a very long time, already since the 1920s. And Lemkin, just simply was fascinated by this phenomenon that he eventually coined the term genocide, but I'll get to that in a second, and kind of followed up on it in the 1930s. And he invented some terms that didn't take very well for genocide. He kept struggling with coming up with a way to get international law to recognize that there is a crime out there that is special and different from other kinds of crimes. And he eventually, during the Second World War, he came to the United States, 1943, and he coined the term genocide. And then he published this in one of his 1944 books called The Axis Occupation of Europe. And he basically coined the term genocide and said, okay, this is a kind of intentional mass murder of ethnic, racial, religious, and I think he even said political or social groups. In other words, he had it very widely cast. But he coined the term genocide in that book. Even beforehand. I mean, in 1943, he had already done this. And then when the war ended, I mean, again, Lemkin was particularly struck, obviously, at this point by the Holocaust, but it's important to understand that he was already obsessed with trying to find something to deal with this phenomenon already in the 1930s, before there was a Holocaust. He knew about the Armenian genocide. There was a big massacre called the Simla massacre of Syriac Christians in the eastern part of the Ottoman Empire, in the eastern part of Turkey and Iraq and Iran, where they all met. And anyway, so Lemkin was already obsessed by this in the 1930s. And in the 1940s, then he comes up with this term, right? And he becomes a kind of one-man lobbying campaign to get international jurists to look at this term and say, yeah, this means something, and we should have a law against it. He goes to Nuremberg in 1946. And the people in Nuremberg listen to him, and he has some impact on Nuremberg. But Nuremberg, as you may know, was not about, genocide or about punishing people, the Nazis, for the Holocaust. Nuremberg was about aggressive war. I mean, the kind of a war we have now, by the way, in Ukraine, where, the Russians have invaded Ukraine. It's clearly a case of aggressive war. And World War II was clearly a case of aggressive war, Nazis against others. And the justices, for a number of different reasons we don't need to get into, weren't that interested in the fact that 6 million Jews, or somewhat less, we know the number now, the better, were killed during the war. That was not their main thing. Their main thing, they used pictures, from the camps and things like this to kind of bolster their arguments, but they were mostly interested in aggressive war, and that's what Goering and others were accused of, and some were hanged for. It was aggressive war. And Lemkin was there at Nuremberg. Genocide was mentioned a couple of times, I think, in the final documents, but basically that's not what they were accused of at Nuremberg. But Lemkin kept up his campaign, and some of it began to stick because people were concerned about what they called crimes against humanity and war crimes, which were mentioned in the Nuremberg indictments. And that helped then put together, and Lemkin, lobbied, and other people too. It wasn't just a single man, right, story, but basically lobbied for this convention that the UN passed in December 1948. And this is a convention for the prevention and punishment of genocide. And in that convention, genocide is defined, right? And it's defined in somewhat narrower terms than Lemkin had defined it. But it does say, people forget this, and I point this out in my book, that in the preamble to the convention, it does say genocide occurs at all times and all places, right? So it's not just Second World War. It's not just Holocaust. It's a general concept of international law that applies essentially to intentional mass murder of a group of people. Ethnic in the convention, they're identified as ethnic, national, racial, or religious groups. Right? Those are the four groups that are recognized. You'll note not political groups and not social groups, which I think is, in retrospect, a mistake, but that's different. That's a different kind of question. And it's destroying the group. And then there's a comma, as such. That means you're not just killing a bunch of people, right? In other words, you're not just murdering Jews, however many thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions, but you're trying to destroy them as a group. So there's this kind of group identity, kind of sociological basis behind genocide, as it's defined in the convention, as Lemkin in some ways conceived of it. And even since, that definition has undergone some evolution as well, since we have courts. I mean, people didn't pay much attention. I mean, it's important to note people didn't pay much attention to genocide or to the convention until the 70s. With growth of Holocaust consciousness, and also, people starting to talk about genocide and Holocaust. And then the 80s, a little bit more. And then in the 90s, international attention turned more to this concept of genocide because we had it in front of our faces, right? In Bosnia and in Rwanda, especially. So those two play, and the threat of genocide in Kosovo at the end of the 90s, 99. So then for Bosnia and for Rwanda, we have courts. The ICTY, that was the court for Yugoslavia, an international court for dealing with the crimes in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. And then the courts for Rwanda, which met in Arusha. So the ICTY and the ICTR then are legal group, are courts that are trying people for various crimes, including the crime of genocide. And they developed then, all laws, develop. I mean, no matter what one thinks of the American Constitution, what applied at the end of the 18th century doesn't necessarily apply today, right? And so laws evolve, and courts are there to interpret the laws. So the ideas about genocide have evolved. And I'll give you one quick example and leave it at that, which is that the issue of rape, was never part of the Nuremberg indictment. Nobody thought about rape as a part of genocide. But it turns out rape is very much a part of genocide. And the abuse of women, sexual abuse and exploitation of women is very much a part of genocide. So you see then the Bosnian courts and the Rwandan courts both documenting rape as a constituent element of genocide. In other words, it is genocide, mass rape. And translate that to the present and what the Russians have done in Ukraine, especially in those occupied areas that were liberated. We know that they raped a lot of women. And that this is then part of the indictment, as it were, that the courts, in this case, the International Criminal Court, which was set up the beginning of this century in The Hague, the courts are paying a lot of attention to rape. So, in other words, there's an evolving way to think about genocide. You shouldn't think of it as a kind of definition that is hard and fast and can't be changed and doesn't evolve. It does evolve, and the interpretations evolve. And God knows we have hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of lawyers, international lawyers in the world who work on subjects like this, and think about